the New Testament is that that is a book of grace. And the Old Testament is a book of law or judgment. And in general, I can understand why people would come to that conclusion, but in reality, there's just as much judgment and law in the New Testament and grace in the Old. God didn't separate it. He didn't portion it out. In the same way that he does not portion out grace in any part of our lives. What Michael said just a minute ago is so true. If God really wants us to get our lives together before we come to him, then in reality, he doesn't have the power that he says he has. He doesn't have the ability to redeem and to bless and to make things new. His power is limited because we have to make some things newer before we come to him, and that's not what your Bible says. He has great power and is waiting for any of us to come from any place, no matter what we've done, where we are, who we are, anything. It really is amazing that he accepts us the way that he does. That's the whole point of us finding and following Jesus. And so as we talk about this amazing grace that we go through, I want you to understand that it's also not just at the beginning of our relationship with God. The grace keeps on coming more and more. And the more that we know of him, the more that we understand. The more that we understand, the more grateful we are. The more that grateful we are, the more we know, the more we understand, the more grateful. And it's a wonderful recurring cycle in our lives over and over and over again. As I said in my welcome time with you this morning, as we go through these next few weeks, some of the stories that I'm going to open up to you, you may be familiar with, you may not be. And in retelling them, it's not that we relearn the story as much as I want to apply the aspect of grace that's always been there so that we can not necessarily know this person that may have lived 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, but that we can understand the truth that God wants us to live in our lives every day when it comes to his amazing grace in our lives. Amazing grace shows up right in the very beginning, right in Genesis chapter 1, the first book of the Bible. Genesis all the way through to the last in Revelation, there's grace to be found. Sometimes it's a little bit concealed. Most of the time, it's plain and obvious for all of us to see. When it's all said and done, grace shows up in the very beginning. And the first thing I want to share with you, in the beginning, when it's all said and done, God made everything for us. And that's grace. You say, well, Shan, where do you get that? Has anybody had anybody ever be nice to you? On purpose? Yeah. How about if someone was nice to you when you weren't necessarily nice to them or gracious? If you've ever been a server at a restaurant, you know what I'm talking about. Okay? When I got up this morning, one of the things I love about living here is at this time of the year, the sun comes up awfully early. And when the sun just shines through the trees there, just, way before 7, and you get that first glow, and the green gets greener, and the blue of the sky gets bluer. Listen to me. God didn't have to make that for us. He didn't make what he did make so that he could show off his power, even though it does that. He made all of that for us. He already knew what blue was. We didn't. He already knew what green was. We didn't. The very first verse says, in the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. He made it. He already was, but he made everything that we see for us. And it goes on to talk about how he made light, and then how he made the earth and the water and everything that walks and breathes. He made all that, and we get to see all of it. This past week, Leslie and I took a walk on a mountain in New Hampshire. And when we first started up the mountain, we thought that the trail was going to be one of those easy things, and it turned out to be anything but easy. And so while we're walking up the mountain, we weren't necessarily praising the creation of God. Let me just say that, okay, while we were going through that. We weren't, but when we got to the top, something that has happened to probably every one of us, you get to the top of the mountain, and you pull out your phone, and on my phone, I've got that panoramic thing, where you start over here and you just keep hitting the button in there. Because, and why do you do that? What's the whole point of that panoramic view? To try and capture what you're seeing. But while we're literally hitting the picture button, we know that it's not possible to capture what our eyes are beholding, what we're smelling, the breeze that comes up from the side of the mountain. I was talking to Tabitha and Elizabeth earlier about their vacation and how they were swimming in a freshwater lake in the summertime. And I told Elizabeth, I remember doing that, and there's nothing, that memory will last with her. The power of what God made right there, that vision, those senses will last with her for the rest of her life. There are scenes that we have in our mind's eye, the beauty of creation that we'll never forget. One of the most amazing things I have ever seen, I've shared with you before about the panoramic starscape at night out in the middle of the ocean where there are no lights to dim a clear night sky. The second most amazing thing is something that one of the guys on board ship told me about. When he began to describe it, I thought it was an old sailor's tale. But he was spot on right. When you're out in the middle of the ocean again, and even if you've been on a cruise and you have the ability to see this, if the weather it will help you to do this. What you do is you get up and you go to whatever side of the ship is facing the east before the sun comes up, just before the sun crests the horizon. And with the curvature of the earth, as the sun begins to rise and you're standing on the ship, what happens? There's a short moment, it's a brief moment, where the sun shines its light right through the top layer of the ocean. And for just a few seconds, there's an emerald flash. And when you see it, there's only one thing that you can do. It's one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in my life. And God made that for us. He made brand new baby boys. And the sounds that they make and the smells that they have. All those things God made for us. And guys, that's an expression of grace. Grace is never just enough. It's always extra. It's not just the sunrise. It's the flash of green. It's not just the mountain view. It's that cool breeze that comes up and refreshes you. It's not just brand new babies. It's how they smell and how they feel. All those good things. God didn't have to make it for us, but he did. What's he say? He made everything and he saw it was really, really good. Good. In the beginning, God made everything else. But then there's a really cool part at the end of Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God only not made everything for us, God gave everything to us. So there's a really neat part. Without reading all through it and kind of squandering a little bit of time, he made the heavens and the earth, and then he made the stars, and he made the land, and he made everything that's in there. And then in verse 26, it says, then, as if when everything was ready, So right now, I'm just going to talk to the guys, particularly the married guys. Okay, here's what I want to try and compare what I'm about to describe to you to something that for the overwhelming majority of married men, we've all experienced. Married men, have you ever been home while your wife's been gone for a few days? That ever happened? Okay, so let's just pick a day. Let's say that she's gone for 4 days. And you and I know that for the first 3 days, we do whatever we want inside the house, right? Just an amen will work. All right. But on that 4th day, when we know that she's coming, sometimes we'll actually take a day off to clean, okay? And we will vacuum. And it will take a little bit longer to vacuum because we're going to make sure that we're operating the vacuum right because we haven't used it in a while, kind of a thing. And I'm exaggerating for the point of emphasis because we want to make sure that when she comes back, everything's ready. And lots of times, even though we've tried, well, that's not so with God. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, then God said, let us make man in our own image. He says it continues on in that 26th verse, let us make man in our image and our likeness so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. God made everything, and then he gave it to us. He gave it to us. That's how gracious he is. The places that we live, the mountains that we get to walk up, the oceans that we get to see, the lakes that we get to swim in, the time that we get to spend, the babies that are new, and the sons that we get to pray for, and then all those kinds of everything. He gave all of that to us. And sometimes the only thing we can do is say, because it's that good. It is literally that amazing. He made everything for us. He made everything, and he gave it to us. And I wish I could tell you that was the end of this part of the beginning of Amazing Grace. But in some ways, as amazing as creation is, as amazing as the experiences that we've had in creation, it pales in comparison to what God did next. Because everything that God made, he made for us. And everything that God made, he gave to us. And he put us in a garden. And everything was really, really good. Until we decided that we knew better. And that we wanted more. Anybody ever been on a vacation and say, man, I wish I could have one more day? John said it's the first time he's taken a 2-week vacation in about 16 years, and it would be nice to have 2 more weeks, wouldn't it? And sometimes the challenge is in our joy, we want more. And in wanting more, we will make, as Michael said, a bad decision. And so those bad decisions, in many contexts, the Bible calls sin. And sometimes that word may offend, but in reality, define it whatever you want, term it whatever you want. You and I know the nightmares that begin and are sustained with those bad decisions. God made everything for us. He gave everything to us. And in the beginning, God responded to sin with grace. In the beginning, he told them everything that they could do. You can go here, you can go there, enjoy this, enjoy that. Rule over all the birds of the air, the fish in the sea, everything that's on land. eat from any tree that you have in the garden, except for one. Except for one. Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 and 17 says, you're free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then he says this, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die. Now, I know that that seems dramatic, but let's make it rather simple. Any of us who have had parents, any of us who are parents, have kids, we've gone through this in one degree or another. It's the burner lesson. It's the stove lesson. It's the fireplace lesson. It's the wood stove lesson. When our twins were really little and we were living in Virginia, we had a big wood stove in the living room. And I can remember when they were 3, I held them. I was on my knees and I held them and I held their hand out. Their hand was like this. I'm holding on. And we got really, really close to the wood stove. And the closer I got, the hotter it was. And the hotter it was, the more they held back. And I kept pushing their hand forward. And I got about this far away. And I said, you feel that? And my daughter's lip was quivering. Don't touch. Don't touch. Play anywhere you want in the house. Go in that room. Go in your brother's room. Pull all the clothes out of his dresser drawers. All right? Connor, go in your sister's room. Take all their toys and throw them all over the floor. Play and have an absolute blast. But don't touch that stove. Don't do that. Because the day you do that, it's going to hurt really, really, really bad. And in essence, that's what God said. Look at all that I've made for you. Look at the beauty of everything that you see. Take a look at all that there is. And you can eat over here, you can eat over here, you can eat over here. But that tree right there, don't go there. Because you're going to get hurt. And it's going to be bad. And for whatever reason, we all understand that. We've all heard that lesson, whether it was a wood stove, or it was out in the forest, or it was playing in the pond, or it was playing with Dad's power tools, or whatever those kinds of things are, or other things that we've been told to avoid. And the warnings were very dire, and for whatever reason, we decided that we needed to try it out. We needed to turn on the power tool. We needed to open that door. We needed to touch the stove. We needed to say, I know what the warning is, but I'm still going to do it. In the beginning, God told them all they could do, and the one thing that they could not do. God said, when you eat from that tree, they will die. He wanted Adam and Eve to know that if they did that, it was going to cost them dearly. Even then, it's not that we completely understand the consequences. We never do. When we make those poor decisions, the consequences really aren't in our minds. It's this false thought of what we're missing out, notwithstanding all that we already have. And it leads us astray. And when they did that, the Bible says that everything that God had made was now subject to decay. Romans chapter 8 says, for creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay. Even then, there was a hint of grace. And God had some things to say to Adam, and he had some things to say to Eve, and to the serpent that tempted them and brought them down. Even then, there's a classic line. It's so common. If you've taught your kids a lesson like that, or remember being taught that lesson, the discussion that takes place immediately after the discovery that that rule, whatever the rule was, had been violated. And Adam's discussion with God wasn't any different. What did he do? He blamed her. Right away. It's right. And when you talk to your son, no, my sister did that to me. What did Adam say? The woman you put here. She told me to do it. As if, God, this is your fault. If you hadn't put her here, we'd still be doing just fine. And from the very beginning to the very present, we still blame God for everything that's going on. God, if you hadn't allowed this disease, if you hadn't put that woman there, if you hadn't put that man there, if you hadn't put that car there, if you wouldn't have done this, if you wouldn't have done that, and so on and so forth. And to avoid any of those consequences, we blame him. The woman you put here with me. And yet God's grace shows up. Look at just a couple verses down in chapter 3, verse 21. And the Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. Remember, those of you that have heard that story, they eat from that tree when they weren't supposed to, and then God comes walking up, and when they hear the footsteps of God, which is fascinating to me, they hide. God says, where are you? Which is another fascinating question. The same kind of question that parents have for their kids. When we can see them, we know where they are. We know something's gone wrong. In fact, we may probably even know what's gone wrong, but we want to find out how our kids are going to respond. Where are you? Oh, we were hiding because we were naked. Well, who told you you were naked? It's kind of like the 2-year-old with chocolate on their face. Did you eat from the cake? And we smile at first. But later on, it's not cake. And the consequences are a lot worse. And in that chapter 3, where everything just goes into total calamity, there's a hint of grace. Again, he says some things to Adam. He says some things to Eve, the consequences that Adam's going to have to face, the consequences that Eve will have to face. And then he says to the serpent, the seed, the offspring of Eve, is going to put an end to all this. He's going to crush your head. Now, there's a whole bunch that's involved in that, but let me just bring it right down to where we live. One mistake, 1,000 mistakes. The seed that came, his name was Jesus, and God sent him and said he was going to come and provided that hope that notwithstanding the consequences, the restoration, the joy, the real joy of life can be restored back with a relationship with God because of who Jesus was going to be, when he was going to come, and what he was going to do. That's the grace. Because it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter where you've been. It doesn't matter what you've done or even what you're doing right now. Jesus came to cover all of that, to forgive all of that. If you're here today and you're thinking, you know what, I like this message. It's not the first time I've heard that, but I've got things I've got to take care of. I'm just kind of smiling. Because if you want to take care of them, you would have taken care of them a long time ago. You would have done it. Because being able to sleep well at night, knowing that those things are taken care of, is completely different than wondering if you're going to be able to take care of them. And simply put, Jesus can make you sleep well. Genesis chapter 3 says this. For God so loved the world, the wicked world that invents ways of evil. He so loved the world that he gave his only Son. He allowed his wrath to be poured out on Jesus by allowing him to die for you and me. That whoever believes in him will not die, but have everlasting life. Grace gives you and me the opportunity to restore a relationship with God through Jesus. No matter who you are, no matter where you've come from, no matter what you've done. We still try to fix things. We try to paint over them. It's kind of like that old construction line that says, caulk covers a multitude of sins. No, Jesus does. Jesus does. Grace started out right from the beginning. God knew, just like we know about our kids, that just because we teach them the lesson doesn't necessarily mean that they're safe forever. That sometimes our own curiosity, if not our own desires, leads us into places, leads us into circumstances that once we've made that foolish decision, we really wish we wouldn't have. And just like Michael said, God doesn't sit here and say, how stupid are you? I told you not to touch that. I told you not to go there. I told you. God, that's not what God does. You know what God does? He says, I am so glad to see you. I've been worried about you for a long time. I don't even have the words to be able to tell you how much I love you. But I do have a son. And I want you to know that he died for you. And no matter how hard you try to fix things without him, it's going to come up short. I know you know that because I know that you've tried it. So why don't you just come to Jesus?